Hi, and welcome back to the Skylark song by J.M. Frey. Time for chapter 16. The next few weeks passed exactly as Robin expected they would. In the mornings, she forced herself through push ups and, when her ribs allowed for it, crunches and other exercises in order to stay fit enough to actually work the pack when the time came. After, the seneschal always brought in a light breakfast, a very sweet porridge that was simultaneously gritty and gluey and took some getting used to. He never spoke to her unless it was absolutely necessary, and that was usually when Robin was testing the admittedly limited length of her leash. After breakfast and ablutions, Robin pulled her strange hair out of her face with Al's goggles, put on the servant's dress, which was always swapped out for another one when she inevitably got it covered with grease and oil, or ripped it into strips to make insulating mittens, or any of the other number of things she did to them in an effort to get them to give her some goddamn pants, which they still refused to do, stubborn snobs. Then she was escorted to the workroom, where she made a show of carefully pulling apart, cleaning, and then putting together the weaponized individual navigation system. In her mind, she dubbed it Wings, and she very carefully scrubbed away what appeared to be several centuries worth of rust and grime, despite the fact that it was supposed to be no more than 100 years old. She polished away tarnished and banged out dents, focused on cosmetic improvements that masqueraded as mechanical ones. She made the actual repairs it required slowly, stretching them out over many long afternoons while the Coyote watched over her shoulder, eyes glimmering in earnest fascination, but clearly understanding nothing. "Why did you need a mid-flight for this?" Robin asked, somewhere around the fourth day. She was carefully appearing to file a gear tooth without actually shaving off enough metal to make the gear useless. "Our engineers did try," the Coyote answered from a large wingback near the glowing fireplace. The days had grown chillier, but the windows had to remain open for those times when Robin chose to fire up Wings. The Coyote spent most of this time sprawled with tight dignity in the chair, polishing his sword, or pistol, reviewing stacks of official-looking papers, or reading reports. That is, a guard who was never really actually as distracted as he appeared. And aside from the fact that he actually seemed to enjoy Robin's company, she had no idea why he felt he needed to be here. Possibly they fear she'd damage the pack rather than repair it, or destroy it, or even choose to burn the place down. Which she had actually considered. She was honest enough with herself to admit that the only reason she hadn't deliberately set her prison ablaze was because she knew she would end up dying in the fire alongside the enemy stronghold. She was a coward, maybe. Or perhaps she hadn't quite reached the level of despair needed to commit suicide by sabotage. She had a plan, after all. "I can see that," Robin scoffed in answer to the Coyote's explanation. "Try being the imperative concept here. Far as I can see, their so-called repairs have actually made it worse." The Coyote gave her his full attention then, setting aside his paperwork on the spindly side table and relaxing back into his chair. He liked talking with Robin, that much was clear, and if she were honest, Robin found him interesting to converse with as well. She knew next to nothing about Klonn culture and beliefs, and it was fascinating to someone as mechanically minded as she was to try to understand the deeply rooted whys of him, even when they weren't trying to subtly trick one another into revealing vital plans or secret information, even when they were just talking about favorite foods, or what the weather was doing today, or who the people in the portraits in the hall were. Nonsense, meaningless conversation meant only to fill the air and the time as Robin tinkered. The kind of comfortable, easy chatter she'd watched her parents indulge in every evening for her entire life. When it was clear that the issue was being compounded with each successive attempt, the king opted for a fresh outlook, the Coyote answered. Before, being called a consumable resource, a fresh outlook, would have offended. Now, Robin smirked, feeling comfortable enough with their gentle banter to be cheeky, and to know that she wouldn't be punished for it. "Maybe she just doesn't like you." She patted the casing of the pack, marveling that even now, when she hadn't turned it on in days, the metal was warmish under her hand. The Coyote shot her a strange, thoughtful glance. "I thought you said it was not alive." Robin's hands stilled. There was a trend towards anthropomorphism in the air patrol, to call your glider a she or a he, to give it a strapping name. Robin hadn't been aware that she'd been calling Wings a she until just now. It was unsettling a little, after all the talk of hobgobs when he'd first brought her here. It's not, Robin said. I was just trying to be funny. Sorry. Obviously I wasn't. Was not, the Coyote corrected wearily, and Robin felt safe enough to roll her eyes at him. The fearful tension that Robin had experienced in his presence was fading. The threat of the freezing pantry was always foremost in their interactions, but Robin learned quickly that if she was polite to him, he would return the civility in kind. She had yet to see any of their other hosts, as he called them, and oh, how she hated that euphemism. She was firmly of the school that you called a thing what it was, their captors. But their lack of presence did little to lessen the figurative sword that had been hung over her head. She saw the Coyote and the Seneschal and a rotating cadre of soldiers of every skin tone and gender in their ominous navy suits, but never any others. Never this mysterious brother. Never this power-mad king. Though, more than once, she had heard the Coyote arguing in Clonnish with unfamiliar voices in the hall. She had a month to repair the pack for real, to become familiar enough with the layout of the house, hopefully also the grounds, and then their captors would come for their weapon. When that month was up, Robin was determined that it wouldn't be there. Part of the plan, she realized after the second day, necessitated the need to get the Coyote to lower his defenses around her, to trust her to not take off, to keep any secrets he might impart. She had to, for want of a better term, befriend the bastard who had killed so many of her colleagues. Trust me, he had said, but in truth, she needed him to trust her. And he made it easy. Surely he didn't need to spend so much time watching over her. Surely an ace pilot with the Clonnish Aero Force had better things to do than sit in a study-turned-workshop and watch a Sealy fiddle with a rocket pack that honestly shouldn't exist. And yet, he was here, beside her. He was always in her presence, watching, usually silent, and oozing a sort of proprietary contentment that Robin at first thought was sort of creepy. Now that she knew him a bit better, she realized that much of his childhood happiness had been built upon who was perceived to own what in his Clonnish noble house. And knowing that somehow made his strange content possessiveness less creepy, but even a bit endearing? Not so much because Robin wanted to be thought of as a thing, but more because she liked the idea of being wanted. Wanted in a way that didn't just see her as a valuable, exploitable resource, the way the Air Patrol saw her, as a trusty mid-flight who nonetheless was supposed to be biddable, like Wade did, as a dutiful daughter like Mama and Papa hoped for in vain each time she came home, or even, really, like Al, who had seen her as someone convenient, someone close by, and therefore easy to cling to. The Coyote saw Robin for all that she was, clever, strong, stubborn, and sought to impress and enchant her with conversation and inventions and, well, the truth of it was that Robin felt more wholly herself locked up in this prison palace, trapped under his eye, than she had felt in the entirety of her 6 years in the Air Patrol. Robin was a whole person here, and what's more, she was allowed to be. Well, except for his determination to make her look and speak and dress and worship like a Klonn noblewoman, that is, but that was all just shallow stuff, really, in the end. That was all cosmetic. That was for show. And the show was to keep her safe from hosts who reported to a king who had started a war to free their ignorant northern neighbors of their fantasy of deities. A king she didn't need to obey. The real Coyote, the one she met in whispers and between shadows, he didn't seem to care what she preferred to eat, or how she dressed, or who she prayed to. At least she didn't think he did. She hoped so, anyway. He appeared to grant her those things in the same way that she didn't care about how he dressed, or what he ate, or what he idealized. So Robin answered his questions when he asked them, sure to leave out any identifying details about her home, her life, or where she had grown up when the conversation turned in that direction. She looked up at him from under her eyelashes, as she had seen the mid-flight girls angling for husbands do. She touched his arm, lightly and in passing, as Mama did to Papa. She encouraged conversation. It was a good act, Robin thought. He relaxed around her, no longer tense in his wing-back chair by the hearth. His gray eyes started to peruse books and paperwork rather than remained locked on every movement, every turn of her screwdriver, every bending of wire, every scrape against rust. He grew compliant. He grew complacent. It ate away at her, the guilt and anger, making it hard to sleep. It was a game. That much was obvious. But who was playing it best? Who was winning? And what, exactly, were the stakes? The agony of knowing that her own dissembling was all that stood between the Coyote and those comrades she had left behind was enough to keep her well behaved before the seneschal. She couldn't afford to cross him to the point where the Coyote would be forced to retrieve another mid-flight, to kill another pilot. Though, if Renge was next on the docket, Robin wasn't sure she'd mind. Only the thought of Renge's mid-flight quashed her desire for the kind of revenge that endangered those close to Renge. No, she'd hash it out with Renge on her own, face to face, and preferably with wings on, so she could drop the scrubbed-up cow on her head. After breakfast, and a morning of pretending to fix wings, came luncheon. It was taken with the Coyote and usually consisted of cold, barely cooked meats, strange, oozy cheeses, and bread dappled with all manner of small fruit. Robin missed hard cheese, bread that was dark and thick, and the crisp crunch of well-cooked bacon. She missed saying her meal prayers out loud. The afternoons were passed in study. To fill the long hours of captivity while she waited for parts she claimed needed to be scrounged up by whomever was on the outside, the Coyote gave her a stack of books on the history and culture of the Klonn. There had been something soft, something nice in his eyes as he handed them to her, wrapped in a blue ribbon with a flouncing bow. Something almost hopeful. Like he hadn't just been giving her a book, but a piece of himself, a piece he looked forward to sharing. Robin had looked down, away, at anything but his gaze. She told herself she was imagining what she thought she saw there. It was a game. Nothing more. They were both playing it, and she could not let him win. Whether he meant for them to be so or not, the books were not only a gift, but a harsh lesson. The books were written in Saskwyan, and when she looked at the printer's seal on the first book, a shudder nearly made her drop it. It was newly published, probably with the intent of being used as propaganda for the defeated people of Saskwya when the war was over. The thought of a Klonn-occupied Saskwya froze her to the bones. "Why Saskwya?" she asked the Coyote one afternoon, when she'd sent some navy-suited soldier to search for a gauge of spanner that didn't actually exist. "There were people here, you know, when the Nutvig family came to Klonn." He paused expectantly, and Robin nodded to show that she was paying attention. "They say the king rousted those who would not come to heal. To those who did, the ones who stayed, he gave civilization. He taught them that the only gods they should be worshipping were in their own minds and bodies. Art, my dear Skylark, is the jewel in the crown of civilization. The art of song, the art of images, the art of words, the art of nourishment. These are our most respected endeavors. The art of love and the art of war. These are the only things that make life bearable. These are the gifts the Klonn give to those we conquer." He smiled expansively, gesturing as if he expected her to fall into his arms and thank him profusely for the wisdom. Robin shivered, and not because she was cold. He was so goddamn casual about it. That was the worst part, that he believed what he was saying wholeheartedly and whole cloth, that he had the easy honesty of someone who knew without a doubt that he was unequivocally right, even as he left her to her little prayers and preferences, as if he was an indulgent, cleverer sibling who knew she would eventually grow out of it. Insulting, considering it was this very assumption, which undoubtedly matched that of his king, that was the whole goddamn reason for the war that was happening in the first place. Somehow, he could accept her for who she was, a woman fighting hard to be represented in a position no one had ever expected her to earn, doing work that meant she had to try twice as hard as those around her, seely to the bone, and yet still believe honestly and genuinely that everything about her would be better if she just started to believe exactly what he did. It was contradictory and insulting and blindly self-congratulatory. as if her culture and her ways were cute and quaint and novel, but not at all a real civilization by the only metric that mattered. That is, his. Robin realized then and there that everything would just be fine if people stopped deciding that someone else was just plain doing life wrong, when for centuries prior it hadn't seemed to matter to anyone. Seelie or Bene, Saskwyan or Klonn. The problem happened when you tried to tell someone else what they were supposed to believe in. Gods, or just one goddess, or some abstract ideal called the arts. All that really mattered was that people were good to one another. All the same, she read the books. She read them because she had nothing better to do. Mostly, they were about geography, cuisine, the history of the royal family up to and including the recent king's father, and the Klonnish adoration of the arts. No religion in Klonn, my steely arse, Robin thought as she flipped through this last section. Just because you don't build a temple to it doesn't mean you don't deify it. And then, in the evenings, there were the obnoxiously ornate dinners, in obnoxiously ornate dresses, which somehow all found their way into the wardrobe in her room, and box after box of obnoxiously ornate jewelry that lived inside her vanity. This was followed by a few hours in the salon, where the Coyote coaxed her through motions of some Klonn dance or another that she was meant to learn, or hovered over her shoulder while she wrestled with drawing pencils for the first time in her life, or brought in an embroidery hoop and an instruction book to teach her the art of the needle. Robin proclaimed that she was proficient with a loom and therefore didn't need to know how to embroider, but the Coyote scoffed and made it clear that noble women did not weave. Noble women were not crude enough to make anything. They only improved it. The way they call these little domesticities and cultural accomplishments improving themselves. Robin had scowled at him so hard he'd cringed and never brought up improvements again. As much as she loathed it, Robin had to admit that she had never been so well fed in her life. The food was rich, and she gained muscle that her meager rations in the air patrol had prevented. She also gained a few extra curves, the promise of her hips finally coming to fruition with proper feeding up. It was annoying, and threw off her balance enough that she had to make a conscious effort to move with her normal silence. While she enjoyed the private, personal chats, she knew that when they were in the dining room, the Coyote was performing. She had no doubt that there were eyes behind every portrait, ears behind every tapestry. He called her "my dear" and "Miss Skylark," and tucked in her chair for her as if, because she was female and supposedly a Bene noblewoman of some sort, he never quite explained which family she was supposed to belong to, she was no longer capable of doing anything for herself. Every night she grimaced and minced and played along. "Why this pantomime?" Robin asked, somewhere in the second week. She was savoring the last of a pudding made with sweet rice and figs that she'd never had before in Saskwya, but wasn't too patriotic to admit she rather liked. "Because this is the one custom of civility I have managed to keep for myself," the Coyote said, hiding behind his wine glass the way he always did when he was telling a truth he wasn't certain was safe to share. "I am master still of my estate, and I will act like it." "Your estate," Robin said, and set down her spoon. "Of course it is." "Where did you think we were, Skylark?" he asked, with that endearingly puppyish head tilt of his. I don't know, really," Robin admitted. "Not a prison camp, of course, but I've seen nothing but forest and lawn out every window. Geographically, where are we?" By the door, the seneschal cleared his throat in ominous warning. The Coyote wagged his finger at her playfully. "Ah, my dear, you know I cannot tell you that." "Then where are we, not geographically?" "My home," the Coyote said, raising his arms to the side like a stage charlatan. "The country home, at least. One of them." Robin felt something a little deeper, a little more sunken than dread and fear settle into her guts. A clear and certain knowledge that she and the Coyote would never, ever have met had it not been for this stupid war. That he was so far above her in society, in station, that he was wealthy, or at least his family was wealthy, in a way that Robin could not ever really comprehend. And despite that, despite their circumstances, he was compassionate, tender-hearted, and cared a great deal about the suffering of others, even if he was an officious, self-important, scrubbed-up ass about it sometimes. The motivation was flawed, but the concern she had learned was real. If they had met in other circumstances, maybe she could have liked him. Maybe she could have even loved him. She realized now, however, that under those circumstances, he would never have even looked at her sideways. And yet, here she was, sharing his table, being wined and dined, being offered fancy dresses and every creature comfort that she could possibly want, except that most basic of all luxuries, freedom. Omens, Robin realized with a jolt. Laid out like that, it was obvious, so obvious. How had she not seen? The books about Clonnish culture, the food, the stupid dancing in the salon after dinner every night, the wine. Running God's damn hells. He was courting her.
Give up when you're down.